Salvador Dali. The name conjures images of hand-painted dreams. Dali's world can best be understood through the eyes of Mr. A. Reynolds and Eleanor Morse, collectors and friends of Dali for over 40 years.
My first recollection of Salvador Dali was in Colorado, in our cabin in the mountains. There was a huge table full of magazines, and on top of it was a copy of Life. And I remember opening it and looking suddenly at these marvelous pictures that contained things that I'd never conceived before. One of them was the enigma of Hitler, a little photograph of Hitler on a plate. Another was a multiple image of a dog and a horse and a strange creature. I was very impressed by these illustrations. And Sleep, this very enigmatic head propped up with a crutch. They were completely new to me, and I was fascinated by it. Now, that was in 1938. It wasn't until 1941 that I met Eleanor, and I think she can pick it up from there and tell us what happened.
Dali liked things that he called objective chance, and it was just by chance that we sat next to each other at the symphony concert of the Cleveland Orchestra when they were playing a scenario from Showboat for the first time. And when they got to the "Why do I love you?" why, Cupid shot his arrow, and from then on, Ren was a goner.
Well, that's exactly what happened, and I was working in Cleveland at the time, and I knew a fellow that had allowed me to sit in this seat next to this girl that I had spotted in the orchestra, and he said, "You won't stand a chance with her because she goes with all the rich people in town, and the man that brings her in a Cadillac, and you haven't got a chance." And so I took a chance and slipped Eleanor this note, and that was the beginning of the end. And this same friend of ours, Dr. Roseman, a very erudite man, invited us to his house after the symphony as a rule, and we would go there. And one day he went to New York and came back with 3 Dali paintings, very inexpensive. One he sold was bought by Dr. Brosh, the wonderful Sublime Moment, I believe it's called, a marvelous picture that sold for $850. I think Dr. Brosh paid for it. Eventually it went on years later and sold for $800,000 to a museum in Stuttgart. And Dr. Roseman had several other pictures there, and to see these things in the flesh was really something. It got to us.
Dr. Roseman called up and said, "You must see this show at the Museum of Art of Cleveland," which was traveling around the country. And it came from the Museum of Modern Art. So we went down there with him to see it, and he'd already seen it. We went with him again, and we just fell in love with these paintings. The deep perspective and the nostalgia of the landscapes, which to us seemed imaginary, were almost lunar, and then the draftsmanship was unbelievable. I mean, we knew right then that Dali was a genius.
When Dr. Roseman came back to Cleveland with 3 paintings, which was the Grasshopper Child, as I remember it, Paranoia, and the Sublime Moment, these 3 marvelous paintings, I said, "Gosh, I would like to get one. Do you think I could?" And he said, "Well, I know the dealer in New York, and you might call him. He's Mr. George Keller at B-New Gallery." And I called Mr. Keller, and he said, "Yes, I have 1 painting." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, it's called Daddy Longlegs of the Evening Hope." And I said, "Yes, I know the picture. It's in Dali's Secret Life." And he said, "Well, how much is it?" And he said, I recall it was something like $1,250. And about a day later or so, he called me back. And he said, "Mr. Morse, you know, this Dali loves to frame his own pictures, and he loves period frames. And would you like to have the frame that the picture is being shown in now? It's called a frame of the period." At that time I was so naive I didn't ask what period. But at any rate, the picture arrived with the frame on it, and the frame was, I recall it, $1,850, which was more than the painting. And Eleanor and I were just starting out, and was a young couple, and I was a machinery engineer. And this was quite a jolt, but we decided to keep it anyway because the frame had been picked by Dalí. So that's the story of the very first painting that we bought. And shortly thereafter, we bought the average atmospherocephalic bureaucrat in the act of milking a cranial harp. And we agonized over this for a while. Mrs. Dalí had the painting, and there were no more paintings on the open market, and by that time we had met her and Dalí, and she was willing to sell this picture, which was traveling with the Museum of Modern Art show. And we agonized over that, and I went to Dr. Roseman and I said, Charles, I said, this is cost $850, and I just don't know whether we can afford it. What do you think about it? And he said, well, I think that the title alone is worth the price. And we bought the little picture and have never regretted it since.
Correspondence between the Morrises and the Dalís began in 1938 with a letter from Mr. Morris to Dalí. The Morrises' first two paintings, Daddy Longlegs of the Evening Hope and Average Atmospheric Cephalic Bureaucrat in the Act of Milking a Cranial Harp, began the world's largest private collection of Salvador Dali's art, now housed at the Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. Mr. Morris now explains one of Dali's early works.
This painting by Salvador Dali, done in 1923, is called Cadaqués 1923. It shows the little town where Dali's family had a summer home right at the head of this bay. The family house is still there to this day. It is a very interesting painting because it is completely different from what people think about Dalí today. He's an outrageous personality, and it is very unusual to see a work like this, which is very placid. It is stylistic. It refers in the shape of the olive trees, the furry outline that they have, to Cézanne, the French painter. In the foreground, it shows fat ladies, of which Dalí was very much aware that Picasso was well into at this period. It also shows a holiday balloon floating off in the sky, the characteristic terraces of this wonderful countryside, which for 2,000 years have grown grapes. It shows the little church where Dalí used to play as a boy and kicked a football up against the building and became very expert at it, as he told it to us. I think the main thing today to remember is that Dalí was an evolving painter all his life, and this is a very early work that shows a realistic but highly stylized view of the town that he lived in all of his life.
The backgrounds in Dalí's paintings were not from his imagination or from a dream. They were from the landscape around his house and around the environs there. Beautiful, wild country with these amazing rocks on Cape Creus and rock formations, all in the shapes of eagles or lions' heads, and of course, that's where the famous great masturbator rock is. And this was a place that this child had explored as a little boy, because his family went there every summer to stay. And he could hardly wait to get there. He wasn't a very good student in the classes because he was thinking about the summertime in Cadaqués. And of course, then later, all these things appeared in his paintings. We didn't really know before we went to Spain ourselves what the country was like, of course, or what the people were like. But when we got there, we fell in love with not only the landscape, but with the people, because they were very friendly. Dalí was always searching for his own personality, because he had an elder brother who died about 22 months before he was born. And they named Dali the same name that the brother had been called Salvador. Then Dali came along, they called him Salvador, and the father's name was Salvador. And over the matrimonial bed in their bedroom was a picture of Christ crucified, which was Salvador. And so Dali, as a little child, he was very mixed up with all these Salvadors. And then they kept talking about the little brother and be careful, put on your scarf because you'll go out and you'll die just like your brother. And so it was very hard for a child. And he was constantly searching for his own identity. He adored his mother. And when she died, he felt that fate had dealt him the worst blow that it possibly could. However, it's very significant that we never saw one portrait that he did of his mother. However, he had painted his sister. She was his model until Gala came along, and she hated Gala, and Gala hated her. But he never had done any portrait of his mother, and this has always been a mystery. Finally, in Maley's garage, where Maley had all these precious things stored, there was one portrait of the mother.
Marvelous picture, but then the mother died, and the father married the mother's sister, the aunt, and so most of the pictures you see are of the tieta, the auntie, not the mother.
He lived down near where all the medieval people were practicing courtly love. And in fact, Charles Roseman, who was instrumental in our getting to know Dali, wrote a thesis on courtly love to get his doctorate, and Dali was delighted about this coincidence. You see, that's objective chance again, and he felt that that was very important, because that's the way he met Gala when she came with Paul Éluard to Catechese, and they saw each other on the square, and it was love at first sight.
Everybody knew what Dali looked like. Everybody knew that he had a famous mustache and that he was a very dapper and dashing person.
Well, his photograph was on the cover of Time magazine.
Yes, that was in the 30s. So the world was beginning to know Dali already. So he was already pretty well known, and when we met him, he looked just like we thought he would. A little smaller, I think, than
shorter.
He appears very big in some of his pictures, but actually he was quite about 4 inches shorter than I was, I think, as I remember it. And we had a very, very nice talk with him. We had quite a long chat about I asked him why he didn't have any children, and he said, one Dali in the world is enough. And I said, well, that's not a very good reason. He said, well, the real reason is that Picasso had plenty of children, and that one of his boys went crazy and took off all his clothes and took a napkin with a death's head painted on it and put it around his waist and walked all around the streets of Paris, and everybody was scandalized at this. And at that time, the language problem was quite a big one, and we had the fact that we were speaking a mixture of French, Spanish, and English. And he used the word crâne, I believe was the word. Am I correct? For the skull. And I didn't get the word. He couldn't figure out what it was. And he drew on a napkin a death's head. And it lay on the table, and we understood what he was talking about, that this man, Picasso's son, had put this death's head on his apron that he was wearing over his privates when he was walking in the streets of Paris. And this was the actual conversation that was the main part of it, as I recall it, the most important one, except for the fact that Dali then had an appointment and he had to leave, and he left, and we left, and Eleanor said, where is the drawing that Dali made on the napkin? We went back, and the waiter had gotten it, and it was gone.
When we were with him, it was always a wonderful time, and he had such a great sense of humor. We were always laughing, and it was very gay in those days with Gala and Dali.
Yes, it's true. They were much younger, and it was always fun being with them. We never had a visit with them that wasn't really a great adventure.
They asked us to come to New York before each show, and we would go down and help them get the show hung. And Gala one time took down a painting and she varnished it, and we were together that way. And then Dali would tell us about the paintings in the show, explain them to us, and he would allow us to pick the one that we wanted to buy. And that was a great experience, and sometimes frightening, because the price that he wanted was far more than we should have spent. And so we would offer a lower price, and Dali always accepted it. And then we were very worried about how we were going to get the money to pay for it. We did buy a few other artists like Miro and Chagall and de Chirico, but we always went back to Dali because we just loved him. And my father, of course, when he saw our first acquisition, which was Daddy Longlegs of the Evening Hope, he was absolutely scandalized and very unhappy, because we had just been married, and he thought if we kept on spending our money on foolish things like this, he would end up having to support us. And our friends also had about the same attitude, except, of course, for Dr. Charles Roseman, who had Dali's himself. But we never thought of them as investments when we bought them, because we liked them so much that we just really couldn't do without the painting.
And I think it has never been really, we never talked about it very much, but basically we had quite a collection of surrealist art, because when we met Dali, he was a surrealist, and we gravitated into that area. And as Eleanor said, we had quite a few works, Magritte and Tanguy, and marvelous pictures, really, that all of them went on to set record high prices, but which we sold over the years to buy Dali's. So we ended up not with a surrealist collection that we kind of started out to do, we ended up with a Dali collection, and nothing but Dali.
He had spent his youth, when he was going to school in Madrid, going to the Prado each Sunday and studying all the masters of the past. And I think that's another reason why he is such a great painter himself, because he did base things on tradition. This painting is called Girl with Curls and was painted by Dali in 1926. You will notice that it is displayed in a shadow box. That is because Dali loved to see his works in shadow boxes. He felt that that was the best way to show them off. And so therefore, my husband made the shadow box for this painting. The painting depicts the plain of Amsterdam, which Dali loved so much, his native land, and it is very meticulously done. Now, in the foreground is a large girl with pear-shaped hips. That is because that was a kind of hip that Dali liked, and his wife, Gala, had that shape of a hip. But this, of course, was painted before he had met Gala, whom he met in 1929. So this was sort of a premonition of this, and a very erotic type of dream-like figure is seen in the girl. It's, to me, very interesting that in the same year, Dali also painted a picture of the back of his sister called Girl's Back, with her curls hanging down her back. Now this he did in a style completely different, and that was a Vermeer-like style. And this, on the other hand, although the background is very like Vermeer, the foreground is sort of the beginning of his surrealist style. We had the privilege of knowing Dali so well, and seeing him, traveling with them, and having wonderful times with them, and learning so much from Dali and from Gala too.
Well, the first trip that we took with the Dalis was when we got on the train in Cleveland, when we knew they were going on this lecture tour. that they had signed up for to go to 8 different cities. And we went with them, stopped in Chicago, changed trains, and went on. And a snowy night, got to Cedar Falls, Iowa with them. And the next day, there was a big reception for Dali. As I recall it, I gave a lecture on Dali at the university, and then that night, Dali gave a memorable speech because it was his prediction that the DNA molecule, when it would be discovered, would have a spiral shape. Well, nobody had even really heard of the DNA molecule, but he was saying that the life force is going to have this shape. And I found it a very moving and prophetic experience. And I remember in particular, before we went on the stage, they asked me to go on the stage to help translate because they thought his English was problematical. And we went down below in the theater to the men's room down there, and we were standing side by side in the urinal, and he reached over and he hooked my little finger with his little finger. And I said, Dali, I said, what's this all about? And he said, this is the leak of fear. He said, before the bullfighters go out, they always ceremoniously do this to get their courage up to go out and fight the bull ring. And he said, you and I are going up on the stage to fight the bull, and this is a very symbolic gesture. It's a little touching little kind of a thing, you know. Then in 1954, we went to Europe for the first time, and we went to Rome with the Dalis, where they were having a show, and Count Teo Rossi, who was sponsoring the show, was out skiing, and after a week of waiting in Rome with the Dalis and having a marvelous time with them, going all over the city and looking at their Dali's Rome, which is a fabulous place. We saw things that nobody else has ever seen. And we decided, the hell with this, we're going to Spain. So we did. We popped over to Spain and went to Port Legat for the first time in our lives in 1954. And it was a hell of a trip. It was about a 5 or 6 hour drive up a very narrow road from Barcelona. Then you got to Figueres, and then you got onto a dirt road, and you went over an even worse road, over 122 curves, till you finally got to Cadaqués. And it was dusty, and when we got there, the Dalis, of course, weren't there, and we stayed in this miserable little hotel, and spent a week there exploring for the first time. We got a taste of the Tramontana, which is a wind that blows in Amsterdam, which you cannot believe. It blows so steadily that you say a man can lean against it and go to sleep. And it's a tremendous phenomenon of the countryside. We found out about that and many other things that we didn't know, because it was our first visit there, and we were enchanted. The first night we went to their house, it was, of course, pitch dark, and you have to walk down this rocky path to get to the hotel, to get from the hotel to the Dali's house. And we walked it up and down this rocky path with Dali many, many times before the roads were finally improved years later. So when we got to the Dali's house that evening, the lights were out, and we had a flashlight, and the Katrina came and let us in the door. And I don't know whether Eleanor had the
I let out a yelp,
because here,
and Dali was very happy.
Because she had shined the light on the flashlight on this big bear. The bear was about 7 feet tall, had a calling card. It held Dali's calling cards in a silver tray in its paw. But when everybody comes in the door, they see this huge bear, which was given to him by Edward James many years ago, and he always had that in his front hall. And it scared the dickens out of Eleanor.
Yes, that's the first thing I saw, and I let out a yelp, and Dali was absolutely delighted. Yes. My reaction was just what he wanted.
So that was our first evening with the Dalis in their house in Port Legat. I remember one time in the Hotel Port Legat early on, in '56 I think it was, we were staying in the Hotel Port Legat. His house was down below, and I saw a light come on the ceiling of our room. I got up and I saw Dali come into the studio, stand there and look at this painting, the Infanta that we have, for about a half an hour. And I stood on the porch there watching this thing, and he looked and studied it. He reached over and he took one brush, made one stroke, put the brush back down, turned out the light, and went out. And that would, I say, took nearly 45 minutes. And incidents like that, that's rare, but that's the way he worked. He did work hard. He knew what he was doing, and he thought about it a lot. That proved it right there. And one time I found a painting that he didn't like, an early painting that he was burning up, and I found it on the dump, and I saw the canvas there. I recognized it, part of it, and in the middle of the night I thought, my God, that piece of cork is on that painting called Anthropomorphic Beach. And I got my flashlight, I went down to this dump that was still burning in back of his house, and the fire was just getting going and coming near this piece of cork. And I had my hunting knife, and I took it off, and I cut this thing off of the canvas and got it. It's a piece of cork that we still have in the collection, of a finger pointing at a hole, very erotic type of thing, shaped like just a cork. It's a piece of fisherman's cork. I brought it home. Eleanor was furious about it. It's been a matter of controversy ever since. Dali worked during the day. He didn't want visitors. He wouldn't see them. People would come. On rare occasions he would say hello, said come back tonight, but he would never take time from painting. When he was in Port Legant, he was working hard all day long. He played at night. People came in. We had the soiree. It was always fun in the evening. Many people came in, just walked in, strangers from all over the world, people that knew him. And we felt our role in the thing there was to keep out of the way. And I'm just beginning to understand now really how great his mind was and what he accomplished within the brain, because he raised the question with his Paranoic-critical method of how do you get more out of the brain than was ever put in it. In other words, if you get a new idea, how did the new idea get into the brain? And so in my studies of his two books, The Conquest of the Irrational and La Femme Visible, one was written in 1930, The Femme Visible, The Conquest of the Irrational in 1934. And in these two very, very abstruse and marvelous books, he told this whole thing. He predicted, for example, that the agony of abstract expressionism was going to come, and sure enough it did. It came in the 50s. And these books were very prophetic, and in them he elaborated on this Paranoic-critical method of how he would just be going to sleep or just waking up, and at that point he could go into his mind and get something that was absolutely new. And it came out as what we call an eidetic image, like Christ spoke of the lilies of the field, because the people at that period weren't ready for abstractions. And so he painted these things for which there were no labels. And this is the big problem, I think, with Dali in the world of art today, and his role, is that the things he painted, the critics had no words for. In any references that are made to the Dali's Paranoic-critical method, you must remember that he was not speaking of dreaming. Dreaming is a completely different process. The creation of an idea was what concerned Dali, and he was able to do this en sueño. There's no word that I know of in English, maybe drowsiness, but there's no good word. The Spanish word en sueño means just between waking and sleeping, and of course the Spanish take a siesta every day, so they get an extra bout at this thing. And when you're waking up, it's called hypnagogic and hypnopompic images that can be grasped by your conscious mind. And in my studies of this thing, I finally came to the conclusion that the overbrain had nothing to do with this. These new ideas came from inside the brain, and this is what Dali was doing. He was tapping the inner brain, not the outer brain. And this is where we are getting thoughts that weren't put in our head by any experience that we have. And the marvelous thing about this whole study has been that we have finally begun to see what a great discovery Dali made. Because when Dali was working on the Paranoic-critical method in 1930 to 34, we didn't even have the word subconscious in our dictionary. It came in afterwards. He was dealing with Freud when Freud was really writing, but Freud had never heard of, he called it unconscious the unconscious mind. Well, of course, the mind was not unconscious. And so out of it finally came the word subconscious, which is a part of where we get new thoughts. And the interesting thing about Penrose was that he said, you think in objects. And he went and he proved it. He proved that Mr. Einstein made his discoveries not on the verbal level, but on the eidetic level inside the mind. And then he attached the labels later. And this is exactly what Dali did in his paintings. He created these images, and later the people began to put words to them, and we called them soft watches and lions and all these other things, but there were no real words that could be attached to these things that Dali was dreaming up through this process of getting new ideas out of the inner brain. So we sat down, and for about 2 weeks we thought of every incident we could that we had had with Dali, every experience since 1943 until 1956. And then at the same time I commenced a Dali journal, which I have kept up every time we saw Dali, talked with Dali, or anything Dalinian came up. I have kept it up until to the present day. It's right up to date. And it recounts what we knew about Dali, the experiences we had as we had them the night before.
Mr. Morse has kept a running journal on his experiences with Dali since 1956. In over 15 volumes, Mr. Morse has created the definitive account of Dali's life. By recording all of his experiences with the artist, Mr. Morse has been able to distill the true Dali from the popularized media figure known to the public. Not only is Mr. Morse the foremost authority on Dali, he is also extremely knowledgeable about concepts of the brain, stemming from his recent study of Dali's Paranoic-critical method.
And the question always comes up, well, Morse, why didn't you use a tape? Well, I tried using a tape when we were going with them on the SS France. The first place, the background noise was too bad and too noisy. And the second thing was that it wasn't possible to get all of the conversations that were going on and so forth. So I never used a tape recorder after that, and I never before. And all of the things that I wrote down were my recollections of what Dali said, what he did, what happened, who was coming, who was going, what crooks were involved, what new paintings, commissions he'd gotten, all of the things that I could remember that I felt were Dalinian. Things that weren't Dalinian, I didn't try to keep track of them. You have to understand Dali's background and know something about him to do it. We went there, we studied his countryside, I tracked down the pictures, where they came from, where his inspirations came from, whether they were from his countryside or academic, whatever they were, and I tried to get a book that would be publishable, and no company would touch it, because they said, who's ever heard of you? For the first place, you're a completely unknown person. And the second thing is that these things are all very explanatory. You can read, you can see the picture, you can see where it was painted, you can see the shadow coming down on the real mountain, you can see the shadow in the painting, and you've done all this stuff, but nobody's ever done it before, and you're just a collector. And nobody would touch this book at all, so we finally ended up publishing it ourselves. It's called A Panorama of Dali's Art, because quite by chance, the collection began with his early works. It went through his middle period, Surrealist period, and ended up with his very latest works. And we didn't plan it that way. We bought them as they came along, as they turned up. You didn't go to the store like buying a Picasso today. If you want to buy a Picasso, you can go to any city and probably buy one if you've got enough money. But with Dali, you can't do it because you can't find them. I think one of the most important things that we should make note of is that Eleanor has probably translated more of Dali's works than anybody else. Haakon Chevalier translated his Secret Life and the Hidden Faces, but Eleanor has really been the principal translator, and I think one of the things that made her work so accurate was that she had the access to Dali, and she could talk it over with Dali. She could call him on the telephone and ask him questions, and I think it made her translations very much more authentic than some of the others who tried to, if they didn't understand it, they tried to make believe they did.
Robert de Charne I translated several of his works, and he said that he preferred to have me do it. He'd had someone else do another book because I understood Dali and I knew exactly what it was he was talking about, whereas this man was easily shocked, I believe, and so he did not put down the actual words that Dali had used. And Robert thought that it should be exactly what Dali had said and not
well, I agree entirely with that.
Made
and
more
I feel,
palatable.
Well, palatable or not, one of our problems today is that everybody wants to emasculate and censor Dali. And he was very frank, he used all kinds of words, and he didn't mind what he said. And he wasn't afraid to use the words that today are not so-called polite words. And I am afraid that you're going to lose some of the sparkle in the marvelous character of this man by censoring him.
In 1932, Dali wrote a book called The Tragic Myth of Milais's Angelus. And it was lost during the war when they fled from Arcachon and had to leave when the Germans were coming in. And the manuscript was lost for years until after the war was over. And finally it was published, and it was only in French. And so I read it, and I decided that it should be translated so that everyone else could read this wonderful book. And in so doing, and in reading it in French, I realized how Dali got a lot of these ideas, you see, because it was the same sort of thing. Just when he was falling asleep, that he would have these pictures of the Angelus, which you know is a famous painting in the Louvre Museum of the couple praying at in the evening when the Angelus sounds. And it's well known all over the world. But Dali always felt that there was something very, very anguishing underneath this painting. And so when he was famous, he went to the curator of the Louvre, and they took it off the wall and x-rayed it, and they discovered that in the center of the painting, between the couple who are praying, was an object that was shaped like a child's casket.
The interesting thing was that at that point, the reason Dali was so fascinated by this was that there were three paintings which Dali considered the greatest paintings in the Louvre. The first was Watteau's Embarkation for Cythera, a marvelous painting of these people getting on boats in this kind of a nostalgic scene. And that is considered one of the greatest. The other, of course, is the Leonardo. And the third is the Angelus of Millet. And a crazy man got into the Louvre and spent a great deal of time debating between those three pictures as to which was the most important, because he wanted to stab the one that was the most important in his psychotic problem, whatever it was, that Dr. Lacan eventually got into the picture because he was called in to deal with this man who came and slashed the Angelus. And here was this picture and Dali just loved this because he always loved the picture, and he thought it was great that this had happened because he always did things in the opposite direction. When you would go here, he would go there. When the television man would say, come in over here and rehearse, he would come in over here. And it would be a tremendous success because he did just the opposite of what they expected, and it came off much better than the TV directors could have done himself. One time we received a telephone call from him to come to New York. Immediately there was one catastrophe, so we went to New York, and he was storming up and down the room. He was absolutely furious because his sister had written a book and called the Dali as seen by his sister. And in the book, she said that he was just a nice boy, a fine little kid, and just everything was fine, and he was really a great fellow. He wasn't this crazy demand and all of these things, and he was just a nice person. And Dali was furious. He said, I worked all my life to create this image of a monster, of somebody that's terrible and crazy, and my sister comes along and says that she's ruined my career. She's destroyed the image that I've been working so hard to build. This is a disaster. And he said, I have a card printed here saying that I disown my sister. I wish I have nothing to do with this book. And I'm going to hand this out to all my friends, because he said, this is an absolutely terrible thing, because I worked so hard, and now she's destroyed my legend.
I think that he built up that image purposely, That's true, because he came from this little town there in Figueres, you know, out of the way place, a big world that he wanted to break into. After he went to Paris, he realized that he'd have to do something different to have anyone notice him.
One of the things I learned early on was that Dali was Dali, and nobody can steal his thunder. You cannot out-Dali Dali, and we've watched people over the years think that they can do it better than the Dali, but that's not true. They cannot do it. He was a genius, and he was making his own image, and he knew what he was doing. And on one occasion, we arrived in Port Legat, and went to see the Dalis immediately, knocked on the door, and Gala came to the door, and she said, what are you doing here? This is terrible. You have just come to cash in on Dali's publicity with Air India. I said, Gala, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about. You just come for the publicity. And I said, that's not true. I said, we don't ever have anything to do with Dali's publicity. She said, oh yes, you're here just because of this. And I got so mad that I went out, Eleanor followed me, we went back to the hotel, and I said, we've had enough of this, and we're leaving. And the phone rang, and it was Dali, and he got Eleanor, and there was lots of weeping and tears and everything else, and I stood my ground, and we packed up and we left. And that did more, I think, to soften Gala up towards us than anything else, because I stood my ground, and because we did not know about this publicity of this elephant that became a swan, became an elephant. You could turn this ashtray over that he made for Air India. We had no idea about it at all. His little elephant was going to walk across the mountains and so forth. We had no idea. And Gala had this picture in her mind, and she really tore into us.
Dali was not acting that way at all. He said to Gala, you're carrying this on too far, and you're going and stop. And she still wouldn't stop.
We didn't let him dominate our lives, or he would have. He would have had us waiting on him hand and foot, which was what he wanted. And he ruled a court of I don't know how many people over the years that they came and they went. We were always there, and he used jealousy. He would try to make people jealous of each other. And when we'd go in Barcelona, and there'd be a big room full of people, and this terrible decision would be made as to who was going to be invited out to dinner. Well, we always went out to dinner with him, so we weren't too concerned about it, but the people that were there were just jittery as to whether they were going to be invited to go with the four of us for dinner. Sometimes he wouldn't take anybody at all, and sometimes he would take a couple of beautiful models that had absolutely no brains at all. And you never could tell who the people would be. But he ran this big show, and he loved jealousy. He was.
Well, he liked to be a king.
He liked to be a king.
He's surrounded by courtiers.
Called him Dali's court.
And so he did cultivate jealousy between his courtiers. All the kings did that, so he did too. But he also had secretaries that were very jealous, and they especially were jealous of us because we had so many paintings and had known Dali for a much longer time than they had. So that caused them to be very jealous, and they did all sorts of things to try to keep us from the Dalis. They would not deliver messages and, any sort of a subterfuge.
I remember the one time we went on a picnic, and we came over to the house that night, and Dali said, where were you all day? Why weren't you here? He said, And I said, well, what's the matter? I said, we went on a picnic. You knew we were going on a picnic. He said, no, you should have stayed here because the Duchess and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were here, and you didn't get a chance to meet them. And I said, well, Dali, I'd rather be on the picnic than talking to the Duchess of Windsor. And he didn't like that very much, but we were independent of him in a way, in that way.
Personally, I was very sorry that I didn't go to the that I went on the picnic and did not meet the Duke and Duchess of Windsor.
Well, I could have cared less.
Dali used many symbols in his art. Some of these symbols include grasshoppers, elongated hands, bread, skulls, pianos, and his infamous crutch.
As a child, he found a crutch in the attic of the place called the Muli de la Torre, which means mill tower, and it was a house that was owned by friends of theirs called the Peachots. And he found a crutch up there in the attic, and he grabbed onto it and he wouldn't let go of it. It was just was a very great comfort to him. He was very little and he could lean his chin in the crutch, and it became the symbol, of course, of help and support in his paintings later on. The title of this Dali painting is The Weaning of Furniture Nutrition. Now, some of these titles were worth the price we paid for them. As a matter of fact, this was Dali's favorite small painting. And whenever he had an exhibition, he would ask us to bring the picture and allow him to show it in the exhibition. This caused quite a bit of furor because we did not like the lone paintings. However, we did this for Dali several times, but we hand carried the painting back and forth to the exhibition. It is a picture of the Bay of Port Lagat, the beautiful bay on which Dali built bought a shanty belonging to some fisher people, and later expanded it into his unusual home. This depicts his nurse sitting on the beach, and you notice that the crutch, one of his symbols, is holding her back up. And she is transparent because Dali felt that the Bay of Port Lagat was like the Sea of Galilee, and that all these fisher people were so religious that they were transparent. You will also note that the night table has another night table cut out of it, and that there is a bottle on it, just the same as the bottle which was cut out. Dali loved to do this type of thing, and he was often do it in different paintings. There are boats on the shore there, just as you see them today in Port Lagat, and there are also net menders. And so at the same time that this woman is his nurse, it is also a net mender. You will notice also in the background on one of the hills a tiny tower, and that is a mill tower which is still there today. It has now been made over into a very interesting residence. This bay is really the opposite direction because Dali painted this picture in a mirror. So when you go there, it will be the opposite of what you see here.
He was supposed to be in the Surrealist group, and they didn't really like him because he didn't like politics. He was just a plain Spaniard in exile and nothing more. And not in exile then, but a Spaniard living in Paris and painting, and very successfully. And he was the only real Surrealist. And Gala repeatedly said that Dali was never a Surrealist, and I said, why not? He said, because he was not bourgeois. He said all those people were bourgeois people, and Dali was not. And she never had any use for them herself, and she was in with them long before she'd met Dali during the 20s. So at any rate, the expulsion, so-called, came as a trial after in 1934, and they did have a kind of a facetious trial, and Dali had a thermometer in his mouth, and he kept taking his temperature and making really kind of a farce of this thing, because there was something about that he was gonna booger Breton. And this was very shocking to everybody, and that Gala said that proves that they're bourgeois. They don't know anything.
Well, he said, can I help at what I dream?
Yes, and he was dreaming of making love to Hitler and all this stuff, and he said, I can't help what I dream. And it was just a general parting of the ways, because he was a real surrealist and the others were phony surrealists, because Dali was doing things that were surreal, but none of the other surrealists really were.
Well, they had certain hang-ups. It was all right to criticize the church, but you couldn't criticize some other thing.
Yeah.
And they just were bourgeois in some ways, but thought they were very avant-garde, whereas Dali was completely free. No moral or aesthetic things were bothering him at all.
During the 40s, the surrealists all fled to America. And Dali, like all the others, took refuge in America, and they spent the winters in New York, and they spent the summers in New York, and they spent the winters in Carmel in California. And Gala drove this big Cadillac back and forth across the country from 42 until 48, when they went back to Spain, finally. And it was very important. They weren't just camped in New York or camped in Carmel. They moved back and forth between the two places, and they drove, of course, through Arizona, where they stopped and saw Max Ernst, and they knew America quite well by the time they got through with all the trips that they made back and forth. And when we were in Carmel with him on one occasion, he took us to his studio, and he told us that there he had been painting the Enchanted Beach with Three Fluid Graces, this large painting with three figures in it, one of whose head is formed by rocks in the distance and so forth. A very magical picture. And he said that it was painted very quickly. And I said, well, why, Dali? And he said, because a vine was growing in the window of my studio, and it was coming across the studio and approaching the picture. And I began to feel that this vine was coming in to seize the picture and would seize it and steal it. And I painted faster and faster and faster until I finally got the picture done. And I got it done before the vine reached the picture.
One evening I decided to go into the museum, which was in a wing of our office building then, and look at the wonderful paintings we had there, because most of them used to be in our home, and we still had a lot in our home, but I missed the ones that were in the museum. So I walked in there and I began to look at the Columbus very closely, and I was thinking about what Dali had said, that we would understand what the sea urchin shell meant later on. And he had put bands around it just as if it were the world, you see. And so you had Columbus stepping onto the new world, you know. And all of a sudden I noticed the bumps on the sea urchin shell, and they began to resemble the craters of the moon, and I said, Eureka, I have it. Because Dali meant that this was Neil Armstrong taking the first step on the moon, as well as Columbus taking the first step on the new land. And so I rushed to the telephone, because Dali was in New York then at the St. Regis, and I called him up and I told him this, and he said, "Is exactly right." He said, "You is good, you is no take so long these time."
One of the things that comes out of that is the fact that, of course, then we went to New York and we met Neil Armstrong and all the other astronauts, because everybody was around Dali. And over the years, we met many, many people that we never would have met if it hadn't been for him. We met Max Ernst, we met Count Theo Rossi, and
say nothing of Alice Cooper and
Andy Warhol, and Richard Estes and lots of others. And he knew all these artists, and he knew all these people, Paul Bury, all of them. And he insisted that we go to their shows. But he was good friends of theirs. And when he was in Cleveland, we took him to the Cleveland Museum of Art, and they had this huge retrospective of Expressionist art, and he went through it all, and they gave us the director never came near him, But he sent a little docent to take us around, and Dali absolutely bowled this poor little girl over because he knew every painter. He knew when he was born, what he'd painted, and the girl couldn't believe that here was Dali that painted anti-abstract painting, talking about all these people. They were all friends of his. It was really a very interesting experience. Once he made us go to, invited us to go to Richard Este's studio. And we said, well, that's wonderful. He paints these wonderful, realistic things. And so we did, and he was a great person, and we met him. Now he said there was a large picture on the wall of a drugstore, and a big light reflecting, all absolutely so real that you thought you were right in the drugstore. And on the glass in front was just one very speck of paint, like that, white paint. And I looked at it and I thought, my God, that must be an accident or something. And I said something about it to Dali. He said, Morse, he says, you is one of these stupid men. He says, that is what makes the picture. He said, don't you understand? And and after I was taught by Dali how to look at it, and I saw what that one random stroke on this very realistic picture did in the reflecting on the glass, it just made the picture. And that's the kind of art lessons that we got from Dali all the time. We are looking at the painting called Nature Mort Vivant, or Still Life, Fast Moving. That's a contradiction in terms, and Dali always loved contradictory things. This particular canvas was painted by Dali in the years 1956 and 1957. We were in the studio when he was painting it one time, and quite an exciting event occurred. Madame Claire Booth Luce came to Port Legat from Rome on Onassis's yacht and came into the bay of Port Legat with a contingency of people. And as they walked into the studio, she looked at this picture and said, Dali, I don't understand it. And Dali said, it's very simple. He said, everything is romping and jumping about, in his inimitable style.
This work celebrates the discoveries of modern science, here reanimating a traditional Dutch painting by the artist Floris van Schooten. The twisting fruit dish and the spiraling florets of the cauliflower head on the right represent versions of a spiral, both in man's world and in nature. Dali felt that the spiral was the basic form of life, which was revealed when Crick and Watson discovered the spiral structure of the DNA molecule in 1953. Although the painting seems chaotic, Dali has ordered it according to a mathematical grid based on the golden section. This Greek form provides an aesthetic harmony and balance to the jumping and romping composition.
We had big debates with Dr. Roseman and Dr. Brosh and our friends that loved Dali in Cleveland, we were arguing about whether Dali's draftsmanship or his ideas was the most important, and we maintained that the ideas were more important than the technique. And so we had a painting copied that belonged to Dr. Brosh, the Grasshopper Child. And I had the two framed exactly alike. You couldn't tell the original Dali frame from the one that I had. And I showed them both to Dali. And I said, Dali, tell me which is the fake. And he studied it for a long time. I would say probably 10 minutes, looking at the two pictures and comparing them. And he said, finally, this is the fake picture. And this is the original picture. And I said, well, how did you know? And he said, well, the way I determined it was that I could see, and he had very sharp eyes because he could paint an ant, and there were miraculous things he could do with his eyes because he could really see, and he could see the little brush strokes. And he said, this man is niggling. He said, he's feeling for the line. My line is straight, and I can see it goes like this. And here, there's a very tiny, very smoothly painted picture, but he could see, and this is the way he tell. It was only a small picture, and he was able to tell exactly which one was his by the technique.
The Masterworks. The term Dali Masterworks, coined by Mr. Morris, refers to the 18 paintings that Dali created between 1949 and 1971. These are Dali's most ambitious paintings, often taking a year to complete and measuring 5 feet in at least one dimension.
Well, the name of the painting was the Hallucinogenic Toreador, and Dali had started it in 1969, and he was in New York, needed some pencils, and so he went into a stationery store and they handed him a box of Venus pencils. The trademark was the Venus de Milo on the cover. And Dali took one look at that and he said, "There is me next painting." And of course this was his Paranoic-critical method at work. And when he looked at that, instead of just seeing the Venus de Milo as we do, he saw the head of a toreador emerging from the Venus de Milo. And so he went on and made this beautiful painting, and we saw it when we were in Spain. We saw it on the easel, and our son was with us that year. And we all three fell in love with this painting. So there was no question that we were going to buy it. And then we saw it again in New York and wanted it even more and made the arrangements to buy it. But Dali said, "No, I haven't quite finished it." And we were a little wary about that, you know, because it looked so perfect. But he said, "No, myself is putting one rose and one other thing."
Voltaire.
And the Voltaire, the disappearing bust of Voltaire. So he had to take the thing all the way back to Fort Legat to do that. And so then it had to be shipped to us. And we were there at the time that they were doing this.
First they bring all the fishermen in from the local little place where they take their boats out down below the house, and Arturo gets all the help he can. And Mr. Isidro Bea, Dali's studio aide, and they would take the canvas off the stretcher and roll it up onto these large rolls, which were, there were about 17 of these big pictures that were made from 52 to 79. And the huge roll is about 2.5 feet in diameter, and they carefully roll it up with wax paper in between. And then they hang it in a box. There's a pipe goes through it, and they hang it in the box so it never touches anything. And this box was fairly large. I would guess it was at least 4 feet square and at least 20 feet long. Huge thing. And they finally got the roll out of the window in the studio and let it down with a pulley and got it in the box, got it on a truck, got it shipped supposedly to us. And then we went to Paris with the Dalis. And every day Dali would call up and say, "Where's the picture?" And we couldn't find the picture. We knew that it was somewhere between, we traced it as far as Madrid, but we couldn't find it beyond that. But we knew that TWA had it. And every day Dali would say, "Morse, you is no concern." He says, "Myself is lose one painting." I said, "No, Dali, it's ours, but don't worry about it. I'm sure it's going to be all right." And Eleanor was furious, and Gala was furious that I was so nonchalant. But I said, "What can I do in Paris? I've already telephoned to everybody that we can, and it's surely going to turn up." So
Dali said,
"Morse,
you is so well organized, and you has lost my big painting."
So finally, when we got home, it turned out that the picture had arrived, had lain on the dock in Madrid for about 3 weeks because they couldn't get a plane big enough to get this box in. It was too big and too heavy. And so finally they did get it into a freight plane, and it went to Dayton, Ohio, and there they put it on a truck and shipped it up to Cleveland. And that's how we got it.
Dali's final great masterwork, the Hallucinogenic Toreador of 1969, is perhaps his greatest and most ambitious double-image painting. The Toreador is shedding a tear for the dying bull. Around these two figures are a host of Dalinian images, including the earlier double image of the bust of Voltaire and a portrait of Gala in the upper left section. This magnificent painting surely reveals the scope of Dali's genius in translating his imagination into images that everyone can share.
We were a little bit different than most collectors in that we didn't buy them for an investment, and it really came as a big shock to us to find out that when we were making some estate plans for our business and the succession of our business, because you know in America when a businessman dies, the government takes his business over to pay the taxes. Well, we said he said, "Is this all of your inventory?" And I said, "Yes, our house and our car and everything." And they said, "Well, do you have anything else?" I said, "Yes, we have these paintings around." And We have some of them in the office here. Do you want to look at them? And he said, do you have a price on them? I said, we carry them on our books of what we paid for them. Oh, he said, you can't do that. You have to have an appraisal. So I got John Tancock from Park Bernay to come out, and he came up with an appraisal of about $37 million back in 1979. And this changed the whole complex again, because in order to pay a tax on that many $1 million, you have to sell about 3/4 of it to get the money to pay the tax. So at that point, we decided to try to give the collection away, and we went to museums from Boston to San Francisco, and everywhere we went, the people said, we'd like to have this picture and this picture, but we wanted the right to sell the rest. And we said, no, we'd like to keep the collection together. That was our objective, but no museum would agree to that. They didn't. They said they would not keep them together. They wanted the right to sell them. The deacquisition is the word they use now. That's a polite word for sell. And we felt that it was more important to keep the collection together because it did show a panorama of Dali's art. And the result was that we had given up. And the Wall Street Journal then wrote a little article, a little squib article that said how difficult it was to give away a $37 million art collection. And the problems, I told them some of the problems we had and the conditions they wanted to impose on us. So we just forgot about it. And a phone rang, and a man from St. Petersburg called up, a lawyer, said, I would like to come up and see you with our city manager. We'd like to talk about your collection. So these two gentlemen came up, Jim Martin and Rick Dodge here, and talked to me about the collection. I told them our problem, and they said, well, we don't think we'd have any problem with keeping the collection together. What are your terms? And I said, well, at this condition, you give me $2 million to build a building, and you give me $1 million to spread out over 5 years at $250,000 a year to get us going, and we will assure that this thing will probably be self-sustaining, and we will keep the pictures together.
We called her up, and I said, Gala, we're going to put your museum in St. Petersburg. And she said, that's very good, because I was born in St. Petersburg in Russia. Well, she was born in the outskirts, but to her it was St. Petersburg. So she felt that that was a very good omen, and it certainly has turned out to be one.
Nestled in a beautiful waterfront park in downtown St. Petersburg, Florida, the Salvador Dali Museum is the permanent home to the Morses' collection of Dali paintings, drawings, and objects of art. While displaying various exhibits of Dali photographs and sculpture, the Dali Museum features a panoramic view of its rotating collection of 93 oil paintings. The museum's collection spans over 50 years and includes 5 of Dali's 18 large canvases known as the Masterworks. Each of these Masterworks took Dali a year to complete. Essential to the Dali Museum are its guided tours. Museum docents help explain Dali's paintings to the public, sharing anecdotes about Dali's life and information about his themes and symbols. The museum now includes a new wing at the south end of the gallery. Known as the Raymond James Community Room, it features rotating exhibits of Dali's graphics, photos, and book projects. While not on display, Dali's artwork is stored in a self-contained, halon-protected vault located within the museum's new wing. The Dali Museum is home to the largest library of Salvador Dali information in the world. With more than 5,000 volumes, the Dali Library Archives is an excellent research facility for Dali scholars. The Dali Museum's co-director and curator, Joan Croft, has worked closely with the Morses over the past 20 years. Next to the Morses, her extensive knowledge of the collection is unprecedented. Miss Croft has guided the museum for over 2 decades. She is responsible for fulfilling the Morses' vision to honor Dali's genius. The museum has one of the largest shops of Dali-related items in the world. The museum store offers a wide variety of books on Dali and a selection of unique items including jewelry, videos, perfume, and clothing, slides, Postcards and posters of the works are also available. In addition, the Dali Museum store offers a mail order catalog.
The way we did this was to will the pictures to the state of Florida. And then we made a loan agreement that we lend the pictures for our lifetimes to the state of Florida, so that if they do anything with them, we can control it, because Dali didn't paint that many pictures. Picasso painted 38,000, Dali painted around 2,000, we think. We've never made an exact count, but that's about the proportion. So we have been very firm on the lending thing aspect of it, and we feel that this is one of the problems that we're going to face in the future, that our objective is to turn the collection over to the state in pristine condition, and that we intend to do. We do not lend paintings from the Dali Museum. Our policy is very firm on this because years of experience, bad experiences with lending, have taught us that Dali's precious pictures must be preserved.
Dali did all sorts of ads for Brian hosiery and perfume bottles and blown glass sculptures by Down. Those are beautiful. And, well, you name it, and Dali did it. And can you amplify on that?
Well, I guess so, because I felt that when he did a Chenyu lipstick ad, for example, that it was so well done and such a fine painting that it was going to become a part of his serious art and not be in this commercial side that he was doing just for money. And he poo-pooed the idea at the time, and so we go to a show at the Finch School for Ladies, and to which we'd loaned some paintings, a Dali show that they had, and here was the Chenyu lipstick ad painting in the show with his other serious art. And I said, Dali, you see, I told you, I warned you about this, that this is so well done that this is come back now. It's been taken out of the ad has been run, the picture's gone, it's been sold back on the art market, and now it's here as your art. And we had quite a set-to on that. He said, no, it's unimportant. He said, it's not important. But I said, yes, it is, Dali, because the rest of your things are inspired, and this you were paid to paint. And so I was very critical of his behavior in some of these things. And I learned the hard way that you don't criticize Dali and win, because one time we saw this ad of a bromo seltzer ad that he did where he swallowed this bromo seltzer and this big magnification came up and a big balloon came out in his stomach and he burped and he bubbled the stuff out, and it was just awful. And when we saw him the next time in New York, I said, Dali, I said, really, I said, that was the worst thing you could have done. We're not getting good reviews for your art. The art museum people think you're a phony, and you come out with this burping up this damn Pepto-Bismol stuff. And I said, this is really terrible. And I carried on for quite a while, gave him quite a lecture. And so when he got all through, he reached in his pocket, he pulled out a check for $60,000, and he looked at me. He says, Morse, is it possible you make $60,000 in 5 minutes work?
Well, Dali once said to us that the reason he did this commercial art was so that he would have enough money to do whatever he wanted to do in his paintings, because that was what was important to him. And of course, to me, that made a lot of sense, so that I can see exactly why he went into all these things. Furthermore, people were very avid to get a hold of them because commercially they were very popular.
He did a series of chess set pieces, which were, of course, very easy work because he used thumbs and fingers, and his own, and also the fingers of
Marcel
Duchamp. And they loved to play chess together, and they made it out of there. He made these, just took their own hands and made impressions of them, and they put them up, and that became the chess sets. He did a whole series of sculpture for Sabater, who sold them to a dealer named Isidro Clot in Madrid, and we have a complete set of them here, one of the only complete sets that there were. Now, they were done by Dali's own hands in wax. And his hands were getting a little hard at the end to maneuver, and the wax was getting hard for him to do, but he did these things, and they are genuine Dali sculptures. Dali did many carpets over the years for Mohawk. They were used in hotels. He made some drapery material, and they were used. We have samples of them, of the drapery, but we do not have a sample of the hotel floors that he designed, but they were very nice. They were illustrated in Life and Look magazine. And then he did some designs for Mohawk which were never reproduced, and we were able to buy those from a man that bought the original gouaches. Somebody in Mohawk sold them when the company was liquidated, and this man bought them, and we bought them from him. And we have had those made in carpets which are about 6 by 9 feet, which are stunning carpets, and they're important. And Eleanor pointed this out because the dimension that comes out, when you see them in the gouache, they're just flat drawings. But when you see them, the big 9 feet blown up things with the shadows in the foreground, the things recede and come out, it's really a tour de force which showed that Dali knew exactly what he was doing. And here he could make this little 20 by 30 painting, and then we'd blow it up to 6 by 9 feet, and it was stunning.
In the mid-40s, Dali started to design jewelry, and an Argentinian named Carlos Alemany came to him and was very happy to cooperate on this project. And they produced some very beautiful things. And my husband gave me some of these beautiful jewels. You will notice that I am wearing a soft watch and bracelet and earrings to match. They are in the style of Cellini, not very Dali-esque. And here in the box I have a beautiful Tristan and Isolde with the goblet between them and a little telephone earring.
As I say, this kind of makes us into freaks in the art world a little bit, because we did not speculate in Dali. We bought his works because we loved them, and we kept them. And we never sold any except the two that I mentioned for special, very special things, and Dali knew about it and approved of it. And we had a completely different relationship with the man that brought us to a different state of understanding, because we got to be friends of his, and we just felt that we were in a different category. And we did another thing that was that we knew the artist. I made a speech in front of him, as I told you, and no other collector ever stood up in front of an artist and made a speech on his art that I know of. You can look at a Dali painting and look again and again. And we lived with them in our home for 40 years, and we would still find things after years that we hadn't seen before. And looking at them every day. It's just unbelievable what he put into these pictures. And people, one of the interesting things is how many people come back for another look.
Dali had a sense of humor, and he was always clowning around like that. He said myself as one clown, and he liked that. Well, he said someday people will learn that I can also paint. And he said that he had many facets to his personality, and he was like an iceberg. 9/10 of everything was below the surface.
And people hadn't seen it yet.
That's right. And he was right about everything. Since we knew him so well, and we really loved him, and we're very sad that he's gone now.
And I would concur in that. When you ask me Dali today, I immediately think of a man that I knew well, a man that if I had a business problem even, I could call him up and discuss it with him, and he would give me an answer that was a reasonably good answer. Very astute person, a knowledgeable man who gave us an education in art that nobody else in the world has ever gotten, in my opinion.